Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Parak. I coordinate the annual country study program at KSU, and this year is the year of Cuba. And so we've had all kinds of programs and events for the year of Cuba. And before I introduce our speaker, who most of you know very well, I wanted to ask, is anybody in the room going to Cuba in March? We have? Yeah. Okay. One student in the room. I was hoping we'd have a few more come. We have about 13 students who are going to be going to Cuba in the spring as part of the Year of Cuba program. And on December 4th, later this semester, we have a group of graduate students who just got back from Cuba who are going to be presenting. So if you'd like to hear more about Cuba, come to that event. You can also go to the Year of Cuba website and look at all the different programming. You can see that we're recording this lecture today. And so all the Year of Cuba, the lectures and events have been recorded. So that's also a resource for you if you're interested in learning more about Cuba. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Vivian Kirby, who's a senior lecturer in economics here at Kennesaw State. She's been here since 2005. We've collaborated and partnered in several projects over the years, especially some other study abroad programs that Professor Kirby has been a part of. And so it's great that we're collaborating this year with the Year of Cuba, and she knows a lot about Cuba. I think she knows as much as anyone on this campus about Cuba. So the students in the class that she's teaching are also very lucky to have her as your instructor. She teaches primarily courses in macro and microeconomics and economic development. She's also taught courses on international trade and investment, economic development at Menlo College in California and at the University of San Francisco in California. Her interests include economic development in developing countries, international trade, strategic market research, industrial and competition policies of the European Union, the political economy of the People's Republic of China, small NGOs, and public international law. So please join me in thanking and welcoming, well, not welcoming, Dr. Kirby to the Year of Cuba program.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Dan. Okay, all right. It's a pleasure to be here and share some nuggets of knowledge and insight that I have into the country and society of Cuba. I was there last in April and May of this year, and prior to that, I visited in November of 2015, and there's a lot to be said regarding Cuba. So we're just going to focus right now on entrepreneurship in Cuba to date. Okay, so I thought I'd kick off the presentation with a few photos here that show you some of the faces of entrepreneurship in Cuba today. We see local clothing designers who are retailing their own designs. And we also have individuals who have opened up a salon where they provide facials, massages, and other types of beauty services and health services. Okay. Here is a map of the country of Cuba. Okay. I chose this one in particular because it shows you the main highway system in the country. And believe it or not, the highway was actually built in 1927 by the 5th president of Cuba when it was still a republic. And the highway, okay, is concentrated around the city of Havana, and it connects Pinar del Rio, which is in the far western corner of the country, to Havana, and over across to Matanzas and Baradero Beach. And the main line of the highway just kind of crosses over the backbone of the island all the way down to Santiago de Cuba in the far southeast end. Okay? And the highway system hasn't changed very much since then. They have repaired the highway and they have extended it and made it wider, but for the most part, it's basically the same highway system. Okay, so let's take a quick review of some of the economic indicators of post-Soviet era Cuba to understand where we are at today with entrepreneurship in the country. We'll begin by looking at Cuba's overall economic freedom score in comparison to that of the other Latin American countries and the rest of the world. Cuba is shown down here in lavender color, and as you can see, when it comes to the overall economic freedom score, they are very far below that of the other Latin American countries. Okay? A quick view of shares of output and employment by sector for the year 2017. The percentage of total employment in agriculture is 18.4%, but note what their share of total output happens to be. It's far below the share of employment, which tells you what about productivity in the agricultural sector? It's very low. It's very low, okay? They employ about 16.5% of their workforce in industry and almost 65% in services. Industry and services are far more successful and show much higher productivity values in comparison to the agricultural sector, okay? According to the CIA World Factbook, Cuba's debt is estimated at approximately 47% as of the year 2017, and about 50% of the government's total expenses are allocated to just 3 programs: healthcare, education, and social assistance. Okay, the more recent GDP growth rates are shown here in this graph. Okay, notice that they took a bit of a nosedive between 2015 and 2016, and again between 2017 and 2018. And they're projecting an estimated GDP growth this year of 1.5%, but I doubt that they will be able to achieve that goal, okay? The lower growth rate in 2018 was mainly due to a decline in Cuba's export earnings. Nevertheless, the economy was bolstered largely by tourism, construction activities, remittances from Cubans living overseas, and agricultural and mineral commodities exports, especially the exporting of nickel and cobalt, of which Canada happens to be a major buyer. Okay, take a look at these economic growth data. Real GDP growth, beginning in the year 1990, okay, continuing on all the way to 2014. In this time period, between 1990 and 1995, the economy of Cuba contracted by as much as 34%. Why? Because the Soviet Union collapsed, and up until that time, the Soviet Union was largely supporting the regime in power in Cuba and the overall economy as well. Russia would export oil at very heavily subsidized prices, well below what it would have normally have charged any other country. And in return, it was importing large quantities of sugar, tobacco, rum, and citrus fruit from Cuba, okay? Employment statistics from the Cuban National Office of Statistics and Information for for the years 2017 and 2018 shows that the labor force size was approximately 4.7 million strong, and the state sector employed roughly 65% of the total labor force, and the non-state sector employed roughly 30% of the labor force. Now, note how the government lists state sector employment versus non-state sector employment. There's a reason for that, and it's a psychological one. Fidel Castro had an aversion to the word private. Private markets, private enterprise, private property. He hated the concept of private property, okay? So rather than list data labeled private sector or private enterprise, he would use the term non-state instead, okay? And the non-state sector was comprised of cooperatives and private employment. And if you see here, a private employment alone was twice the size of the cooperatives, even though there were many more cooperatives than there were individual privately owned businesses. But nevertheless, the private enterprise was about 20% of the labor force, and cuentapropistas made up more than half of that number. So what are cuentapropistas? Cuentapropistas is a Spanish term used to refer to someone who is self-employed on his own or on her own account. They work alone, without any partners, without any helpers, without any workers that they employ, okay? They are basically a sole proprietor of whatever business they are involved in. Okay, let's take a look at the special period. What is the special period? Well, the special period correlates with what we saw during the decade of the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and withdrew its financial and foreign aid from Cuba, causing the Cuban economy to contract by 34%. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it left Cuba with a very severe shortage of foreign exchange to pay for imports of industrial inputs and non-durable consumer goods. Furthermore, to exacerbate this difficulty, they were experiencing a lot of power outages or electrical blackouts, which forced the Cuban government to reallocate a large share of its resources into equipment repair, equipment maintenance, and alternate energy products. Meanwhile, resources were not in abundance to take care of producing enough food to feed the population. So food production fell and the people went hungry. The government at this point in time realized that it was not going to be able to continue to manage all sectors of the economy. Therefore, they took the following actions. First off, they decriminalized the use of the US dollar and began acquiring US dollars through the black market to pay for much needed inputs. And furthermore, they implemented incentives designed to attract foreign direct investment inflows into the country through the establishment of joint venture companies. A joint venture, if you don't know, happens to be a partnership between a host country business, a state-owned enterprise, owned and operated by the government of Cuba, combined with the investments brought in by a foreign-owned company. And most of the joint ventures that were established in Cuba were from Spain. A limited number of private occupations were also legalized. Okay? Now, during this same crisis, dollars were used, as I mentioned, to pay for needed imports. And the dollar was eventually replaced by the convertible Cuban peso in the year 2002. And the government pegged the official exchange rate value of the convertible peso to the US dollar, thereby creating an artificially inflated, overpriced convertible peso relative to the old national peso. And since then, Cubans were incentivized to reduce activities and time spent in work that earned them only national pesos, and instead they started focusing on getting involved in activities that would earn them payment in either US dollars or the convertible peso. National pesos, or the old pesos, came to be used by the communist government to pay the salaries of state employees and to sell subsidized goods and services to the public considered to be basic rights, such as basic food staples, education, and healthcare services. Meanwhile, the convertible peso, otherwise called the CUC for short, was used to set extremely high prices on all other goods considered luxuries by the Cuban government. And what were considered luxury goods? Virtually everything else that the government said was not a basic necessity. So the two-currency system that they set up basically led to a huge income divide and the problems that they have been experiencing ever since in terms of economic growth. Okay? The convertible peso, as I mentioned, was pegged to the dollar at par, where one convertible peso was equal to and traded for $1 US. And the Cuban national peso, or CUP for short, could be converted into the convertible peso at a rate of 25 of the old national pesos to one convertible peso. And the convertible peso was used to pay salaries and pensions of state sector employees, and primarily used by the Cubans in the domestic economy for purchasing government subsidized products, basic food staples, utilities, public transit services, spent in national parks, cinemas, neighborhood restaurants, flea markets, and ice cream stands. Okay? Here is a timeline of the relevant events that summarizes the times when the Castro regime had to make changes in their policy to get themselves out of trouble with their economic crisis. And it begins in the year 1962 when the Castro regime nationalizes over 4,000 large and medium-sized businesses. And then in 68, okay, he confiscates a remaining 55,000 plus private small businesses in the country. In 1978, he begins allowing a limited number of self-employment licenses, and these were largely concentrated in food production. Later, in 1986, the Castro regime limits this self-employment through the Rectification of Errors and Negative Tendencies campaign. And then in 1993, shortly after the economic collapse and withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Cuba, he refers to this period as the special period. He's not willing to admit that, it's an economic crisis or a fiasco. He calls it a special period during times of peace. And he issues decree number allowing 117 private occupations to operate, okay, to soften the economic blow of the economic crisis that they were embroiled in. He refers to this action of allowing for private occupations to emerge as a necessary evil. He didn't like it. He felt that it was not in the best interest of the country, but sometimes you have to take medicine and put up with an evil that you don't really like until the state sector can get back on its own 2 feet again and become productive and efficient. And then in 1996, by that time, the number of self-employed sole proprietors increases to about 200,000 strong. But then the government responds by imposing licensing requirements and an onerous tax structure that has the effect of reducing the number of self-employed individuals to 1/2 that amount, or 100,000. In 2000, Cuba enters into a partnership with the country of Venezuela, and he sets up a similar arrangement with Venezuela as what he had with the former Soviet Union. They will be obtaining from Venezuela heavily subsidized oil, and in return, Cuba will send them a large army of doctors and medical technicians and nurses to provide health care services to the poor, the needy, especially in the rural parts of Venezuela. And then in 2010, by then, Fidel Castro will have stepped down from power, and he allows his brother Raul to take the helm. And Raul orders the laying off of 500,000 state sector employees, citing the fact that the state sector had become very bloated, very inefficient, and very non-productive, and therefore it was going to be necessary to lay off these individuals so that they could bring down costs of subsidizing these non-producing, non-efficient firms. And what he does is to expand the number of self-employment licenses to as many as 178 different categories. What was the purpose behind that? To encourage more employment within the private sector of these individuals that were now being let out of these state-owned firms. And by the year 2014, the number of licenses that were issued to anyone interested in becoming self-employed rose to 201, and the number of cuentapropistas reaches more than 450,000. And by 2017, there are more than 550,000 cuentapropistas. Okay, so here are the employment statistics, as I showed you before, okay, just to reiterate, okay. By the year 2017, 2018, we had well over 500,000 individuals in Cuba that were working on a self-employed on their own basis, and they made up about 12.4% of the labor force at the time, okay? Now, let's talk about food rationing in Cuba, okay? They issued ration books called La Libreta, and each household was entitled to receive one of these ration books. And the ration book would entitle the particular household to purchase specified quantities of each basic food item considered by the government to be a basic food staple. And they would be able to purchase these items at state subsidized prices using the old national peso, or CUP. And take a note of the list of items that were considered basic food staples: milk, yogurt, ice cream, eggs, cooking oil, spaghetti, rice, beans, bread and other baked goods, potatoes when they were available, domestic soft drinks, juices, beer, rum, coffee in small quantities that was not even pure coffee. They called it mezclado. Why? Because it was half ground coffee mixed together with half ground split peas or green peas. And they called it the mezclado. And then there was corn and sugar, of course, okay? Now, when it came to meats, there were certain meats that they were entitled to receive in rationed quantities, if and when they were available. And this included ham, pork, sausage, and chicken when it was available. And the chicken was usually imported in from the United States. And fish and shrimp, that was periodically available. And people just had to keep their fingers crossed, hoping that one day they'd get the word that fish and shrimp was available. Okay. All right, so here are a couple of photos that I took of a state-owned store where locals could purchase rationed food items at subsidized prices. On this side, okay, you may not be able to see it very well from where you're sitting, but that's a picture of a meat counter in this store where there was absolutely nothing available to buy except a large, nasty-looking sausage that was black in color, heavily marbled with fat. So it was like black with a black night sky dotted with stars, so to speak, in it. And people would come in, take one look at it, and just back away and shake their heads and not bother to purchase it. On the other side of the meat counter, opposite to it, shoppers are seen here lining up to buy bottled and canned goods while the supplies last. And beef is not legally sold in either the state or private markets in Cuba. It's not legally available for wholesale or retail. Anybody who is caught buying or selling beef is immediately arrested and charged with a felony, so to speak, or the equivalent of a felony, and is subject to incarceration. And anyone who accidentally kills a cow is also considered to be a criminal, someone who is subject to harsh punitive measures that exceed what would normally be imposed upon someone who kills another human being. There is a story of a young man who, at the age of 18, he killed a cow because he was starving. He and his mother were not getting enough money to be able to meet their basic dietary requirements. Consequently, in desperation, he killed a cow. He was caught, and they were going to sentence him to 20 years in prison. But due to his tender age, they decided to let him out after 10 years instead. All right, so the beef that they do have available is imported mainly from the United States, and it's sold to private restaurants that included in their option of menu offerings, okay? All right, now, what about personal items and household items? Well, guess what? These are not considered to be basic needs, and therefore, you have to buy these in the private market using convertible pesos, which are 25 times the value of the national peso. So everything you can think of here, from soap to shampoo, toothbrushes, razor blades, okay, toilet paper, diapers, feminine hygiene products, furniture, bedding, gasoline, appliances for the house, all of these were considered non-essential, and therefore you had to pay for these products at substantially higher prices using CUCs, okay? Likewise, fresh raw produce, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, okay? These were ample and easy to find, but you had to go through a licensed private collective or a licensed street vendor in order to acquire these products. And you had to pay for them in the convertible pesos, Again, it was worth 25 times the national peso, okay? So here's a photo of a private collective selling a variety of fresh produce. I thought I'd include this for a reason. This is a board that just shows you a long list of fresh produce that's available, okay, that's grown in the country of Cuba, but they don't guarantee that on any given day that you go shopping for produce that you're going to find what you want. If you look at it carefully, any item that happens to have a price written in to the right of it is an item that they currently have available for purchase. And if there is no price along the name of that produce, it's not there. You have to come back another day, try again, and try again until you get lucky and see that they do have it available for purchase. Now here they have a list of weights, okay? If they're selling something to you by the pound, by the grams, by the kilograms, okay? They have their weigh scales, and every item sold is going to be weighed down to the very last gram, okay? Now, why am I telling you this? Because to give you an insight as to what the situation with regard to keeping body and soul together was in Cuba and getting into the mindset of the Cuban consumer, I'd like to share with you a horoscope that I got, okay, from a wrapping of an item that I had purchased. And when I looked at it carefully, I realized that it was a horoscope for the year 2019 for Cuban consumers. As an example, if you're born under the sign of Taurus, they're saying your horoscope for the year is going to be one of being lucky to have your shoes not fall apart on you, and when you walk along the sidewalks or cross streets, you're not going to have to worry about potholes or cracks where you'll trip and fall or twist your ankle. And that is the horoscope for people born under the sign of Taurus. If you're born under the sign of Gemini, they're telling you that for the year 2019, your ration of bread will be fresh and tasty, and when they weigh it out for you, it will be weighed out precisely to the last gram of what you are entitled to receive in your ration of bread. So, you know, just keep that in the back of your mind and compare it to the kind of horoscopes that we're accustomed to reading here in the United States. Okay, so food is a major preoccupation, and holding on to the limited supply of consumer goods and making it last is of utmost importance to the Cuban people. Okay, so how much money at minimum does it take to survive in Cuba today? Well, according to the general coordinator of an independent Cuban media platform called El Toque, it takes a minimum of $100 US, or the equivalent thereof, to survive in Cuba today. In other words, that would be 2,500 national pesos, or CUPs. So what is the average salary of state employees? We'll take a look at these numbers, keeping in mind that, okay, it takes 2,500 Cuban pesos to survive in Cuba today. In 2018, the average monthly salary of a state employee was about $31 US. And then in June of this year, the government decided to give everybody a pay increase of roughly almost 36%, bringing the average monthly salary up to $44 US. The minimum salary in Cuba in 2018 was roughly $10 US, and that was increased to about $17 in June of this year. Average retirement pensions for state employees is not much different from the minimum salary, as you can see. So there is a problem. There's a disconnect between what they're earning and what they need to buy in order to survive. So if we were to examine median incomes based on source and type of economic activity, we see that salaried Cubans who are paid in Cuban pesos, they have a median household income of between $300 and $400 US a year, and they represent more than 50% of the population of Cuba. And these unfortunate individuals are concentrated mainly in the rural areas of the country. Then we have emerging Cubans, whose median annual income is almost double that of the salaried Cubans. And these individuals are employed by the state, also paid in national pesos, but they're lucky enough to have other sources of income coming into the household besides their salaries from the state, okay? And then this group represents about 30% of Havana's population. And then we have a group called self-sustaining, where the median household income is about $1,800 US or higher each year. They might have a state sector job, but they don't depend on the salary that they receive from that job. They're involved in entrepreneurial activities that makes their paycheck appear like pocket change in comparison. And this group represents about 20% of Havana's population and other cities as well, okay? So let's look at challenges confronting the Cuban entrepreneur, okay? As I mentioned, okay, cuentapropistas is a term which describes a self-employed individual who works on their own account. Cuba currently allows and authorizes 201 different occupations, most of which are for low-skilled jobs, and none of these are involved in manufacturing or industry. And under the regime of Raúl Castro, after Fidel stepped down, he's kind of had a schizophrenic relationship with the private sector. On the one hand, 1 year, he'll expand the number of licenses available, okay, to individuals wanting to become self-employed. But then, on the other hand, he turns around and he heavily regulates and taxes them as well, okay? And furthermore, to make matters worse, a lot of these regulations or policy changes are not always communicated in a timely or complete manner, leaving entrepreneurs in the lurch, okay, only to be surprised one day that they are in violation of one of the regulations of the regime, and they can face stiff penalties and fines for it, and even incarceration, okay? Here's a list of approved private sector licenses, which includes vendors of agricultural products. Here's a roadside butcher shop selling pork products, and the private market where locally grown produce are available, okay? Now, okay, as I mentioned, the regulatory environment for cuentapropistas has been shifting and convoluted over time, but there is a method to the government's madness. It is tied to the island's political economy, and people don't see the great picture until the very end, until very recently, okay, as to how the government has been viewing and treating the private sector. It's an expediency, an emergency measure that has to be tolerated, until which time the state sector can be bolstered once again, made more efficient, more productive, and then by that time, the private sector will just be pushed to one side and left to fend for itself. Okay, now, for instance, changing regulations and the effect that it had on entrepreneurship. It makes planning and inventory management very difficult. In the period prior to 2010, if you operated a home restaurant, you could only initially employ family members. Sales of beef and lobster in your home restaurant were prohibited, and you could only install a maximum of 12 chairs in your restaurant. But then in 2010, the government increased the number of chairs permitted to 20, and then the following year after that, they increased the number of chairs further to 50 per restaurant, okay? Furthermore, licensing requirements didn't allow cuentapropistas to offer parallel services that made sense to combine together. A great example here is the case of air pump operators, okay? Shortages of gasoline and the need to purchase it using the more expensive convertible peso made bicycle use popular in Cuba. Air pump compressor operators became a popular form of self-employment, and what they do is basically inflate bicycle tires. And anyone who can inflate a bicycle tire can also patch up a tire. But the government prohibited the same person from both patching tires and inflating tires. You would need a separate license for each of these two activities, okay? So one of the strategies that Cubans used to get around this draconian measure was to have another member of the same family obtain a separate license to patch tires while you would proceed to work as someone who would just simply inflate the tires, okay? Okay, complexity of licensing fees is another challenge facing these small businesses. Small business operators were expected to pay a monthly licensing fee by the first day of each month, and if you were late with your payment, they would impose a fine on you, and they'd even take your license away. And they may not return it to you, even if you do get paid up in full. The matrix of fees to be paid were based on whether your business charged its customers in convertible pesos or national pesos. For instance, if you operated a home restaurant in a given neighborhood and your customers tended to be mostly tourists and you charged them in CUCs, the convertible peso, then you'd have to pay something like $800 a month by the first day of the month, regardless of what your restaurant's actual earnings might be. Whereas a similar restaurant just next door that only charges in the national peso might only be required to pay 400 Cuban pesos a month, okay? So there's a huge difference here, okay, in licensing fees. Seasonal businesses were also at risk here. They still had to pay their monthly licensing fee even during lean periods in the year, okay? Bed and breakfasts, restaurants, bicycle and taxi operators whose businesses peak during the popular tourist season and drops off during the hottest times of the year, okay? They had to continue making the same monthly payments even if they weren't generating any income during the low season, okay? But somehow, in spite of these challenges, the number of Cuban entrepreneurs soared from 150,000 strong in 2010 to 450,000 by the year 2014, okay? State inspections are another challenge, arbitrary and inexact to say the least, okay? Stories would abound about the arbitrary ways that inspectors would determine whether the entrepreneur followed legal state-sanctioned procedures in sourcing their inputs for the production of their products and services, okay? A jeweler who repairs watches, okay? If an inspector happens to visit your shop and he asks you to produce all of the proper receipts for the batteries that you used in repairing your customers' watches, if you can't produce the proper receipts and in the correct amount, the inspector would actually accuse you of having purchased the batteries in the black market, okay? Or having stolen the batteries from a state supplier. In the worst case scenario, the owner could be charged with either illegal enrichment or theft of state property. Either way, the penalties were severe, okay? So, some people wonder, okay, what was behind the reforms of Raul Castro in 2010? If we take a deeper look at it, okay, we can say that some of the liberalizations undertaken to make it easy to become self-employed was to help those laid-off workers transition into the private sector and incentivize existing entrepreneurs to employ some of these laid-off state workers. But at the same time, while making it easy to obtain licenses and begin employing workers who were not family members, the state also boosts the tax rate on profits from 41% to 47%. Furthermore, the regime begins overreaching by requiring the private sector employers to start providing their new hires with guarantees of a certain amount in wages every month and employment security. Okay? Let's look at a survey of self-employed Cubans. This data is based on a research that was conducted between October and November of 2017. Okay? If we look at licenses issued by type of activity, we see that over 51% is actually a compilation of various different types of businesses, ranging from construction services, salon services, media, artistic, musical services, and computer services. Contractors employed in food and lodging is also featured, transportation, telecoms, food, and so forth, okay? So, in this survey, they asked entrepreneurs what was their line of work. And the largest category of self-employment was the renting out of rooms in a private home, okay? The next one was working as a musician, a painter. The third was operating a private taxi service. And the fourth was operating a restaurant, okay? They also asked the entrepreneurs, where do you primarily source your inputs and supplies from? Most of them shopped in state-owned retail stores where they were charged in CUCs, and the prices were marked up higher than what they would have paid had they been able to source these same inputs from outside of the country. Another large category of sources of inputs came from other self-employed individuals, and the third came from the black market. Okay? So when asked which group is your primary customer group, by far and away, the majority of the respondents said foreign travelers. Okay, so there's this strong tie to tourism. And there was also a large clientele base coming from right within the domestic market among local Cubans. Okay? Advertising is against the law in Cuba. You're not allowed to put up billboards or signs in front of your store advertising a product. So what do? You advertise or market your services and products by word of mouth. Okay? And another popular way was through the internet. And many others chose not to promote at all. Okay? So when asked, okay, what did you do for a living before you got involved in this business enterprise? A lot of them were actually highly educated individuals with a college degree or training in some kind of technical vocation. Okay, let's look at the latest round of economic reforms under the current president of Cuba, Diaz-Canel. Okay. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, state salaries were raised by an average of about 35% this past June as part of a broader package of economic reforms. They would not give details of the big picture beyond initially raising state sector salaries, but the larger picture has finally emerged that indicates that the regime is engaging in further liberalization of the economy, not to benefit the self-employed or the private sector, but to benefit the state-owned enterprises, many of which are owned and operated by the Cuban military. And they practically have a monopoly on much of the tourism sector in the country. Okay. All right. So that's all, folks.